All right, people, you are in for a ride with Ellen Huet, who is the author of Empire of Orgasm, a Bloomberg journalist, a Bay Area resident, and a really wonderful human being. This episode was very thoughtful, thought provoking, and I think this is one of the best rides we've ever had in our almost 6 years of doing this.
It's fun. We say that a lot nowadays. Like I've noticed that comes up. So we're having a really good time. And today, the quality of our guest was of the highest caliber. We really enjoyed the conversation. I'm really just filled with wonder and gratitude at the depth at which Ellen is willing to go. The conversation did move not just around orgasmic meditation. There was a little bit of a deeper piece there. So it's not just about that. There's a lot of ways that influences the world. So definitely stick around and listen to the whole thing. Please support Blast and the Compton Cowboys. Subscribe. I read the book. I was really thrilled by the book, and I think it's worth a good read. And so we'll be putting something in the show that gives you a cue to go ahead and find the book and take a look at it. Yeah, what an amazing journey. What a great ride. You're in for it.
Sis, hallo?
Blijven.
Bestuur zeker wegen dem.
Joi, iets niet, joh.
Sitaki ubenza, anika sirikie.
Two outlaws on the lam, taking the back roads through America.
You can't drink enough coffee for this show.
And now it's time for Monday Madness with the Moped Outlaws, Greg and Mark.
If you'd like to order a copy of Ellen's book, Empire of Orgasm, you can find it at ellenhuet.com. That's ELLENHUET.com. Thanks for listening. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Moped Outlaws. Today, our guest is Ellen Huet, an award-winning reporter at Bloomberg who specializes in uncovering the strange and complex subcultures of the tech world. You may know her as the host of the hit podcast Foundering, where she covered the sagas of WeWork and OpenAI. She joins us today to discuss her new book, Empire of Orgasm, the definitive account of the controversial orgasmic meditation company, OneTaste. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
So much of this subject is so loaded for people. And I'm really curious about what the journey's been like for you. It started with this Bloomberg article in 2018, and then a tide picked up the surfboard that you're on this article and carried you along. Can you kind of describe how that journey unfolded for you?
Sure. I'll give the sort of overview and then we can dive in wherever you like. Back in 2017, I was, as I still am, a reporter at Bloomberg News. So I was working in San Francisco and I was writing about startups, which at the time were, very vivacious topic to be covering. I was covering WeWork. I was writing about these, VC funded companies. And I got a pitch, as I often do. I get many a day from someone who works in PR. And she was like, hey, are you interested in maybe writing about this fast-growing, woman-led wellness startup called OneTaste? And I was vaguely familiar with OneTaste. I had read an article about them a few years earlier, but I didn't know that much. And I ended up, I asked for more information. I had a call with this person. I ended up having a meeting with the current leadership of OneTaste at the time, which we'll get into it, but it didn't include Nicole because she had actually about 6 to 9 months earlier sold her shares in the company and was no longer officially on the leadership. And that's when I heard the basic pitch about orgasmic meditation and OneTaste. They called themselves the Whole Foods of sexuality, the organic, good for you version of sexuality. And of course, I assume we can explain in a minute what orgasmic meditation is. Happy to get into that. But for my reporting journey, what happened was around the same time, I started asking around on my own, trying to find people who had been involved in the company, and ended up hearing from a lot of people who had a very different experience and a very different take on OneTaste. People who told me that they felt like they had been exploited within the company, whether financially by being pressured to sometimes take on debt in order to buy, increasingly expensive courses, or sexually and psychologically by being taught certain philosophies that primed them to take sexual action that they might not otherwise have, or that they felt social pressure to do certain sex acts to further the company's business, that once they left the company, they felt more conflicted about. It was very complicated and very multifaceted story. And I love stories about human psychology, our shared human nature. I was fascinated. So I did end up writing this pretty in-depth investigative story about OneTaste and about these allegations that the group was a cult and that it was this exploitative community. And that came out in 2018. And although I don't know for sure, in all likelihood that kicked off an FBI investigation that, after many years of investigating, led to a criminal indictment from the federal government in 2023, which then, after 2 years of pretrial proceedings, led to a criminal trial this summer in New York, which, after 5 weeks of the trial, led to the jury deciding unanimously to convict the leader of OneTaste and her second in command with a federal crime. That's the overview. The two women have not been sentenced yet. And I'm happy to dive in at whatever point feels most
So what I'm
salient
curious
to you.
about is there was an article that sparked a lot of energy, probably within the OneTaste community, as well as the other folks who were, maybe celebrity level curious about it. There's a kind of social penetration that they had made into the zeitgeist of the American populace, and that was ongoing. And your article had a point of view about it, which is there was this cult angle and there was some real harm being done. But after that, the intensity of writing about that must have been a little bit challenging. There must have been pushback from and so what had it that you felt compelled to actually put in the massive amount of work over several years to create this tome? It's clearly well footnoted and well researched.
Yeah.
What drove you? What compelled you to actually dive into that level and write the book?
Well, there's a few things. You're right that creating the book took a lot of time, passion, and energy. Took me essentially 5 years to write the book, and it's been 7 years since that first story. I didn't, those first 2 years after the story came out, I contemplated writing a book, but there were other things happening in my life that made it such that I was like, this is not a priority for me right now. And then I took it more seriously in 2020, and that's when I, signed a contract and began officially working on this project. So I tend to say it took me 5 years to write it. And you're right that the original article, for those who have close connections to, or some connection to, the community of current OneTaste associates or former OneTaste associates, for many of these people, OneTaste is a powerful presence in their life, whether it's in the past and whatever valence they might associate with it. It is something that affected them deeply. And so, unsurprisingly, throughout these years, I've encountered various reactions from people who had their own perspective and experience with OneTaste. Sometimes critiquing some of the reporting that I've done, sometimes feeling helped or seen by some of the reporting I've done, or a mix. Of course, it is not simple. Why did I want to write this book? I felt like there were a couple reasons. First, after I wrote that first story, I actually heard from a lot of people who had been involved in OneTaste who I had not spoken to for the original story, who reached out to me and wanted to share their story. Some of them said, there's more to be told here. There's a history of where orgasmic meditation came from, Nicole's history. There's more that happened even in the more recent years that I think is relevant. And they wanted to share. And so, of course, I was naturally curious. And I did end up I remember in the months after that story came out, spending time not knowing where this reporting might go, but getting on the phone and having long conversations with people who had read my story and it brought something up for them and they wanted to share their experience. And I think the other part of me was simply curious about understanding more about this. Like I have no better barometer for what to spend my reporting energy on. Barometer, compass. I have no better compass for what to spend my reporting energy on other than what I find interesting, and I think often people's creative work is best fueled by what they want to see in the world, and what is, what keeps them interested. Otherwise, like I probably am not going to be a good job at guessing what someone else finds interesting. Like I'm just going off of my curiosity. And I sensed that this was a rich story and one that, more practically speaking, scope-wise could fit inside a book. Like I do think about the narrative size of a subject and whether it's kind of like book-sized or not. And I don't really know how else to describe it other than to look at this group and think like, okay, I do think that I could fit what I feel like is a comprehensive telling of this story in the size of a book. Sometimes subjects are much bigger than that.
You need a Ken Burns documentary.
Of course, yeah, or like whatever. Like Robert Caro has spent several books on Lyndon Johnson. Like there are different ways that narrative writers think about this. So when I looked at the subject, I more practically also thought, I think the details of this will fit in a book, but more importantly, the themes, the patterns, the human element of this felt very universal to me. I think I felt pretty quickly on that, although outsiders might look at what happened in OneTaste and think that's really extreme, I don't connect with that, that's not, the experience that I had, even in that reporting that first story, was a sense of discovery and compassion where I felt like the more I heard about the reasons and the emotional environment in which people made decisions within OneTaste, the more I felt like I could connect with why they had made those choices. And so I felt like this was a relevant story for me, even though I had never been involved in this group. And I was hoping, and I still hope, that readers have the same experience, that they read about the environment of OneTaste and the choices that people made within those social and psychological pressures. And they think, okay, I wasn't present for this, but I can take away something useful and meaningful that applies to my own life. Yeah.
Do you think that there's anything positive in this realm of Om to also be taken away, even as a reader?
Yeah, and I hope that the book makes that clear as well. Like, one of the things that also drew me to the narrative form of a book was that it was a format in which I could delve more into like the whole story. Like when you write a news story, in some sense you do have to try to focus on like what's new, like that is part of what news is about. And a book allows you to like really get a little bit more into like a comprehensive history of something and to let readers have their own journey of like multiple points of view on a subject within it. Like I would say like, my personal opinion is that one of the reasons OneTaste even was successful in the first place is that there's a lot of value to the practice of Om. Like it's impossible for me to not believe that after having spoken with people, especially women, who describe a transformative experience in their first dozen Oms, this feeling of, and again, if you want to pause at any point and describe what orgasmic meditation is, we can.
Well, let's do that. That's really good.
Yeah,
this is a good moment.
Wait.
Okay, Greg, go ahead.
Because people can Google it. It's really, because I'm interested. It's very common, especially with, in the entertainment realm, which I'm in sometimes, we often talk about how you could play to an audience of 100 99 people loved you, one person thought it sucked, and you walk away just concentrating on that one person. And I'm wondering if you find that challenging as a journalist, where here you have this book about Om, and what I'm hearing is you're saying the positives and the negatives. And are people tending to just look at the negatives that are spoken about? And is that a challenge as a journalist?
I think I have, my personal view as a human being and as a journalist, and I guess, in some sense, these are overlapping, is often that, yeah, of course, things have like that things in life are multifaceted, right? So that if you look at it on one side, that you might choose to position yourself to look at something and be like, oh, I'm only seeing the good things about this, or I'm only seeing all the bad things about it. It is not, I mean, hopefully this doesn't sound like hubristic, but it is not hard for me to hold both at the same time personally. And at the same time, yes, I often encounter people who read my work or maybe have their own perspective and experience of OneTaste or Om, where they insist on a more black and white interpretation of their experience. I also understand that that's like human nature. We're not great with ambiguity. Maybe it's easier for me to hold both because I didn't have a direct experience with this group. So I also hold compassion for people, for whom it brings up strong emotions, which might lead people to feel like, oh, I need to defend every part of this group, or like I must condemn everything that they've ever done. I often think of my job as like hearing as many voices as I can and then putting together what I consider the most responsible, like, telling. And I fully recognize that, especially in something as divisive and provocative as OneTaste, many people are going to feel like my telling does not match what they would prefer, whether they think that I was too focused on positive things or too negative, focused on negative things. And so, I occasionally get annoyed if it feels like someone's reducing, you're trying to be reductive about what I've said. But I also trust, one of the other narrative guides that I have learned many times in my career and continue to rely on is like, treat your audience, trust that your audience is smart, like treat them like they can figure things
Like
out.
they have
Otherwise,
discernment.
otherwise, what do what's the point? Like,
Right.
I, as a consumer of, narratives and stories and reporting, would like to be treated that way. So again, I have no better guide than that. I'm not going to tell people what to think. And I hope that thoughtful readers can resist the urge to come to a single conclusion based on my reporting or their own experience. The basics are, OneTaste is a company that was started in 2004 in San Francisco by, Nicole Daedone and Rob Candell, although Nicole is really like the visionary of the company. And the company sold courses on orgasmic meditation. Orgasmic meditation is a 15-minute partnered clitoral stroking mindfulness practice. And the idea is that a stroker, usually a man, strokes the clitoris of a woman in a very prescribed manner for 15 minutes. And the only stated goal is for both parties to spend those 15 minutes reflecting on, noticing, and meditating on the sensations in their body. And that the idea is that this practice, if done regularly, can connect you more deeply with, or, can improve your sex life, your relationships, connect you with your sense of intimacy and connection with other human beings, your intuition, your desire, your energy, lots of things. That's how I have often given the short version. But I'm curious what the two of you, is there anything you would add? What was your personal experience with it? And then we can orient the listeners that way.
Beautiful.
Well, you don't mind, Mark? Let me dive in. Mark's was much more.
I'll go. You go first.
No, okay. So for me personally, one of my takeaways was a deeper knowledge of my responsibility of myself. That if I'm in a place of discomfort, it isn't the other individual's responsibility. I don't need to go to them and say, hey, you made me feel this way.
Mm.
I can hold my discomfort. That was one. And the other one was that a no from a woman, which as a privileged white male, was I was kind of groomed, not consciously, but to be, like a no's unacceptable. And that's a whole Pandora's box of chaos. But to be okay with a no and know that that's that moment, and maybe tomorrow the answer's different, and not to get attached to either of those realities, to just kind of keep flowing with life's flow. That was my experience with it.
Got it. Thank you. My experience has a longer timeline and a little bit more intensity to it, but I want to be succinct because I don't want to be the focus necessarily very much. But in 2013, I struggled mightily in a marriage that was now 21 years old. And I encountered a lot of sense of powerlessness around having what I wanted in that relationship, both in terms of emotional connection and then sexual connection. And as it was coming to an end, and my wife clearly didn't want to be married anymore, I had a resource to call on that a man I had known since we were in a band together in junior high school, a man named Ken Blackman, who was one of the premier instructors and someone who had experience with the practice before it was orgasmic meditation. And so he and Nicole had developed this thing. But at that point in time, Ken was getting ready to exit OneTaste. But I called him and I said, I didn't really know anything about OneTaste or what he was doing. He was just a friend I called who I knew was a sage. He was often referred to as Yoda in that circle. And I called him. I said, this is what's happening for me. I feel all this crap. And he's like, all right, I'm going to ask you to do this one thing. And I don't want you to think about it. Just go and sign up right now. And I did. And it was this seminar, weekend seminar called the Ignited Man Seminar that was led by Rob Kendall. And what I experienced there was learning how to connect with men from an emotional point of view and to understand what trust. We did trust fall corporate exercises. We did language exercises. We did eye gazing exercises. That we developed a kind of intimacy practice. And then on the third day, Sunday, we were asked to come in suits for the third day, and we had a super light lunch. And then we were going to be given the opportunity to speak to some, quote, turned on women and ask them anything we wanted. There was no question that was off base, right? And so Nicole was part of the panel. So everybody in the room got to just ask whatever they got to ask. And we all understood what Om was, because after that, there was a demonstration of the Om practice. And so we were invited now as Ignited Men to participate in the community. And the first stage of that, of course, was an offer. Take Orgasmic Meditation 1, right? And it was very reasonably priced. And it was, going to mean that we got to be involved in the practice very specifically. But it was also a public practice. We were in a room with 4 and 5 other people doing this thing. So it was very confronting. And what I learned, and what I really focused on in my relationship to the practice, was the inner development of me dealing with my own fears, my own imagined sense of powerlessness and the dissipation of that, and how to be powerfully embodied as someone who loves sex and loves pleasure in a way that was aligned with women's nervous systems. And what I take away from the overall practice is there's a lot more to it, but that when a man connects to his deepest, darkest sexual desires and then alchemizes it and makes it safe for a partner to experience him as fully in his sexual energy and all his energies, really, that power is amazing. And I had access after that to one of the most rich dating experiences I'd ever had in my life, because the way I approached women and my expectations of them and the way I treated them did not cut off my sexual energy at all, but it also held them in high esteem and respect. And their choices also were something that were held in high esteem and higher respect. And as Greg said, a no doesn't mean anything about me or my value. And that's a really important key lesson a lot of men struggle with, is we're valuing ourselves based on the kind of responses we get from our wannabe romantic sexual partners. So I grew through the period of going to the OM2 class and then started to get a lot of offers to participate in 5-ticket coaching programs and things like that. That turned me off. And I was not part of San Francisco's office after that point. And that was about early 2015 when I started to experience that. And through the interim period, I was a no to everything that they tried to sell me. But I would still come, like I went to a Halloween party there in late 2004. And at that Halloween party, I met my current partner, 11 years. And it was one of the most amazing experiences I've ever had to be with her in that environment, and then for us to choose to be a couple together and exit that environment. And we have the language of intimacy that we both learned more of. It wasn't like we didn't have that, right? But we had a common language now that allows us to have ongoing conversations that are desire-based and that allow for individualized expression and receptivity and listening, powerful listening with our ears and our minds, but also with our bodies, right? Empathy at the highest level. So that's what I've taken away from the practice. And I think that's an important thing men could benefit from, because I did.
Yeah,
Mark's
I mean,
coming
that
out
all
with a book.
makes sense. What'd you say, Greg?
Mark's coming out with a book.
Maybe. I feel shaky right now. Like I just asked a hot woman out on a date. Like I feel so exposed right now. Right. And I
From
think
sharing
that,
your
yes.
experience? Yeah.
And that's a part of what OM is a gateway to, how to manage yourself when you're in that state of being, and how to feel your feet on the floor and be present and not check out. And I think that's valuable. But I think as we learned, as partially from my own experience and then partially from what we see in the book, there's a level at which that vulnerability can be exploited. And it's not just OneTaste. And I think that's an important piece. And when I was thinking this morning during my meditation, which thinking during meditation might be counterintuitive, but I realized that there was a lot of LSD in the story. Right? And I thought to myself, oh yeah, the Grateful Dead's a cult. Right? And LSD plays a really pivotal role in opening people's psyche up to be impressionable and want to belong to something that most people don't understand, and it's like this idea of being part of a tribe that is elevated or unique or special. And that ties back to
that's a common like cult quality. Yeah.
Right. And that ties back to what Greg said about the id. The superego is always lurking there to try and manufacture some grandiose self. And when you're part of that group, whether it's, the Grateful Dead or Est or, and you get this sensation of, oh, I'm part of something special, I'm unique. That feels good, but it's intoxicating. It's not emotional sobriety.
I have a quick question, Ellen. As a journalist, like he just mentioned the Dead and Est, which came from San Francisco, San Francisco. Has the question come up for you as a journalist, why is San Francisco continuing to be a fertile ground of this experience? This sort of potentially cult thing.
Well, I both recognize like my unique perspective on this and maybe the limitations of it. I have lived in the Bay Area my whole life. So in some sense, I have theories as to, I could draw parallels all the way from, I don't actually know that much about the Grateful Dead, but I have basic knowledge. Est, I did a fair amount of research on a little bit of Est. It's tied into the lineage of these personal transformation groups that in some way leads to OneTaste. And then, what I cover right now for Bloomberg has to do with the AI industry, which has its own, I can think of at least a couple stories I've written in the last 2 or 3 years that talk about surprising manifestations of cult dynamics, both within kind of like the AI safety research world, as well as this was a story I just published with a colleague a couple weeks ago, cult dynamics showing up in these intensely emotional and sometimes delusional or even psychotic relationships that people have with chatbots. So that's like a whole other can of worms. But it's been interesting for me to see where cult dynamics show up in reporting that I wouldn't have expected to see. And you're right, obviously San Francisco has a well-known history as being sort of an experimental city that I think that reputation has endured across decades. And the current version that we see is, this like potentially transformative AI boom, or at least the people who are here building this technology believe quite powerfully that this is going to be a transformative thing. And there is, again, with that sort of powerful ideology, you get a fertile ground for certain cult dynamics. It just is how it is. That being said, it's like, I'm not really firsthand familiar with any region in the world other than the Bay Area. So hard for me to say that this doesn't exist in New York or LA or London or wherever.
Well, the Nexium story sort of points to one version of that, right? That happened on the East Coast. So it is possible.
Yeah. So it'd be easy for me to say like these things happen, but the truth is I just have a very San Francisco centric history in my life because it is where I have lived for a very long time.
So is part of your experience as a professional journalist to continually turn that glass to yourself and question, okay, like for instance, what you just said, I am seeing a lot of these things coming up in San Francisco. Is that because I'm born and raised in San Francisco?
I mean, journalism, now we're getting a little broad, but like, journalism in my mind falls somewhere between like, on one hand, you might have sort of like loose anecdotal stories that people tell. And then maybe on the other end of a spectrum, you might have like rigorous randomized controlled trials. And journalism exists in the middle. Like so anytime I'm writing any sort of story, I am trying to think about how statistically I might be mistaken about like how salient or prevalent like a certain phenomenon is that I'm describing. And what's nice is like, what's nice about journalism, it can be flexible. Like you can write stories about individuals and you can suggest conclusions from that. Someone who's maybe like a professional statistician might find that annoying, but there is still a lot of value in those stories. And you could also do, for certain things that might require rigorous data analysis in order to like make your point in a compelling manner. There's lots of approaches to journalism that rely a lot more on strategies and tactics that are more similar to maybe like capital R research. I mean, of course, research is a very broad umbrella, but so yeah, I am often asking myself questions of like, oh, do I have a cognitive bias here about, I recognize that my worldview is limited. That doesn't mean that what I see doesn't have value, but I do try to check myself as I think any responsible reporter would.
Yeah, objectivity is a discipline that informs the story.
Yeah.
Better. What I noticed is there's patterns in the way social groups end up focusing on an individual. And we can draw a through line from Buddha to Christ, through Muhammad to Jerry Garcia to, Donald Trump. Like there's this thing where people take their aspirational elements, their hopes and dreams and desires for shifts, and they project them onto an individual. And then there's a locus of magnetism that's created around that individual. And often there's this cycle where there's the upswing where we're all super happy, that those that are in the group. about that, and we're actually benefiting a lot from the contemplation of it and the discussion points that come up and whatever literature points are coming up. And then there can be this period where the deified persona falls out of grace, right? And for some, that means freedom because they're no longer caught in the orbit of this figurehead. But others become deeply entrenched then in the gravity of it because they don't want to be bereft of the thing that they've attached themselves to.
Yeah.
And that causes a kind of intense grasping and clinging to the narrative that's created. And I'm just wondering what you think that is in humanity.
Well, up until you talked about the like grasping at the last point, I was going to say that, you know, in general, again, as a journalist, I often reflect on, our human, like attraction to stories of a singular person and like the rise and fall. Like, you know, I once read something about like, oh, there's only like 6 or 7 stories really, and one of them is rise and fall, another is like, for example, rags to riches, and there are kind of like story archetypes that come up. And you know, I do think that maybe it's just as basic as like, this is something that is hardwired into most people, is that we are more attracted to stories that have a character at the center of it than an idea. And therefore, when there's a powerful idea, we tend to look for a person who can embody it. And that has just been so consistent across recorded human history that it is, to me, it just feels like, that's just something about our shared, you know, brains. And so when we, you know, that's probably why like even the archetype of like the charismatic leader exists. Like if we weren't drawn to people who embody a movement or people who embody an idea, we would be happy elevating ideas. But that doesn't tend to happen. If there's an idea that gets momentum, it tends to be then represented in somebody. And then that means that, you know, because humans are fallible, like, we like to build them up, and then if something shifts, you know, tear them down. And I think that is, you know, I could speculate that has to do with like, human taste for schadenfreude or judgment, or feeling like, you know, it's a comforting idea to be like, oh, the other people are making dumb mistakes. Obviously, I would never do that. Like, I guess I just see it as human nature. I know that's a bit broad, but
bringing this back into the realm of your book and OneTaste, we're at a place in the story pre-sentencing where we don't know exactly what the consequences for Nicole and Rachel are going to be per se. But there's also the suggestion now that even in their current circumstances in federal prison, that they're continuing to do some work that reflects their core values around human liberation. And we hear stories of people who go through a crucible like this. They meet their worst aspects and they're held accountable, and then something else occurs, a redemption story. The most classic for me is Star Wars, where Darth Vader, the most evil villain, is redeemed in the third film by his son, right? Do you think that that's a possibility for Rachel and Nicole, and for this idea of liberation to be redeemable in some way?
I'm definitely curious to see what happens. And it's hard for me to, from the outside, assess what they're really thinking or believing, or frankly, what's even happening inside. You know, I think it's technically a federal jail because they have not been sentenced yet. So
okay.
My understanding is after the sentencing, they might move to a prison, but that's just terminology.
No, accuracy is important.
Yeah, I have not, I believe I write in the book something along the lines of, it didn't seem likely to me at the time of the indictment, and this hasn't changed in the couple years that then led to a conviction. It doesn't seem likely to me that the criminal justice process has led to a reconsideration of what took place at OneTaste. And in fact, I have generally seen those who are still publicly devoted to OneTaste to generally be like doubling down, arguing that the prosecution of Nicole and Rachel is an indication of prosecutorial overreach or a threat to religious freedom. And my sense from all my reporting is that for many people involved, who are still close to OneTaste, that it has maybe just largely served to calcify their sense that something like that the prosecution is unfair, that the outcome of the trial is vastly misaligned. Misaligned is not correct, but you know what I mean, that is just like incorrect, and that some injustice has happened here. So I don't know. I truly don't know. And I think, of course, I think it's possible. Many things are possible, but I wouldn't say that I have gotten a sense that it seems likely, but I'm curious what you two think.
Well, I noticed that there is a concern based on the ruling itself and the precedent it sets that this could be a precedent that impacts other spiritual groups in a way that would be caustic to the structure and way they operate. And I think that this is somewhat of a landmark ruling in terms of the way that it was applied to the context, which is that rather than physical bonds, the ruling is based on the mental influence of the outcomes and the violence that occurred, right? The idea that people were literally unsafe because there was some violence that occurred. I'm wondering if you think that's relevant and real, that concern that this could set a dangerous precedent for other religious freedoms.
I truly don't know. And I haven't seen, as I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a legal expert. I know that that's been an argument that has been suggested, but I actually just have not, I feel like it's way too soon to say that it will or won't set any precedent. Like it is a case that, was argued in the way that
it
generally is, like in front of a jury of people who had never heard about orgasmic meditation before. These 12 people and the alternates sat and heard all the presentation that was there, and they made a decision. And although, sorry, there's a siren. I don't know if that's.
Don't worry about it.
Okay.
They're coming to get me. Aha.
Yeah. I mean, I just, I guess I would say that seems speculative to me. I just don't know. It's possible, but I just don't know.
Got it. Where does your next inspiration and your next endeavor come from? What are you looking at now for the future of your research and writing?
Broadly, or about OneTaste?
Just in general.
Yeah.
Right? Like you've covered this for 5+ years, 6+ years. What's next for you in that sense? Is there anything coming over the horizon that's intriguing to you? I mean, AI, you mentioned that.
Yeah. I think that's kind of a topic that is human relationships with AI and the second and third and fourth order effects of what that will do to our social bonds, to our collective sense of psychology, and our understanding of human relationships, seems potentially momentous to me. And I intend to try to follow this in a way that yeah, lends itself to like interesting reporting about how these relationships are going to affect our society broadly, and not just the, I think covering the extreme cases of this is an important way to shine a light on like what could happen. Like there are documented cases of people who have ended up taking their own life after having one of these like emotionally intense relationships with a chatbot. Of course, I think we should be talking about that. And I'm also interested in exploring what happens when we have not just those extreme cases, but a broad swath of people having less acute, but nevertheless like pretty significant changes in how they relate to other human beings because of this alternate option that is drawing them away from
Human connection.
connection with like an actual human being. Like a chatbot is not the same thing as a friend. It is not an AI friend. I'm actually pretty against that term, because a friend is another human being with its own potentially conflicting desires, needs from yours. Any relationship that you have with another human being comes with conflict. And these chatbots are designed to not have that. And I think the lack of friction in, or lack of experience with friction, could be like a generational shift, or, just not just generational. It's like people of all ages are using these. So like it could be like a sort of species-wide shift about how we relate to other people. That is something that fascinates me. I don't have an intent to like embark on a new book anytime soon. I think like it's, in order to do a project like a book, you need to feel so much conviction about the match between the project and the subject, which I did feel with this book about OneTaste. Like Empire of Orgasm is a reflection of the fact that I thought that the story of OneTaste should be a book and that I should write it, until I feel that level of conviction again. I don't think I'm itching to like write another book, but when and if the right thing comes along, I would definitely do another one. But I think broadly speaking, it's like I like to look for creative projects that are going to develop my narrative skills, whether that's in a book or somewhere else. That was part of what drew me to the book, was like I knew I could do it, but I had never done it before. And then topic wise, I think again, it's like, how can I find something that fascinates me, that is at this intersection of the human experience and our current technology?
I've been talking a lot, Greg. I thought you were about to ask something.
I was, but it's a little muddy. And a few things. One, like in this realm of AI, about a year and a half or 2 years ago, like we have a Google Home device that you can talk to. AI, it's conversational, the interaction. And I had this thought of what we practice becomes a part of our memory. It's like a unconscious element. And if I don't have manners, potentially I could start creating where I interact with a human without manners, because I just got used to it in a conversational realm.
Mm-hmm.
And with OneTaste and Est and all these things and AI, there's this, and again, this is muddy, but there's this element of its intention is to draw out the best of us as individuals. And we are human with these potential seeds of chaos and madness. And so, like, I don't have a question so much that I think one thing you mentioned, Ellen, that here's the peek into, I guess, what I'm sort of discovering in this conversation. I've always looked at AI as technology. And that's always just been in my consciousness when I interact with it and have conversations about it. And part of what I'm hearing you say is there's this realm to explore that is beyond simple hardware that is happening in this realm of AI.
the ghost in the machine.
Yeah, I guess by hardware you probably mean software, because although there are people developing
No,
hardware.
hardware meaning like a container that is metal,
see.
that is a computer. You know, like
Yes.
that ultimately is technology. Technology is solid physical things.
Sure. I think if I'm understanding you correctly, what I would say to that in response is like, undeniably, this technology, like a conversational generative AI, is you can define it as however you like, but it is having an undeniable impact on human society because it is something that evokes so much emotion from us. Like what's happening is like humans who use this, some people are able to just like use it as like, I guess, a kind of Google replacement. But I think the truth is many, many, many people are also feeling an emotional tie to generative AI that is probably going to keep evolving and changing over the next couple of years, probably at a rapid pace. And I think we're just starting to understand how humans do relate to this. And part of it is because we are wired to project humanness on something that mimics conversation. And this has been true for decades. There are studies and experiences that researchers did in the 60s in which they built very rudimentary natural language robots that basically just parroted like vague therapy speak. Like you would ask it a question and it would say, "And what do you think about that?" And even back then, people had a hard time being convinced that there wasn't a thinking mind behind the other speaker. It is just how we are wired. And, AI may not be like human, but its impact on us is significant because we, on some level, think that it is sort of human, and that we relate to it in the way that we might relate to another human. But the problem is that it is not a person. And so I think in that mismatch is where some of these very like difficult, complex societal effects might end up rippling out from.
So I want to draw a parallel here, specifically pointing at data harvesting. And one of the things that's pointed out in the book is that there was this recognition that OneTaste employees that were quote unquote back of house were often present during vulnerable conversations that were then made into data points that could be used in a sales process. And I think that the way that AI is being handled now mirrors that process on a much larger scale, and that particularly chat companions and Grok and other forms of this are honeypots or data sources where human desires and human interests can then be harvested and leveraged against us for commercial purposes, and that would be wrapped up in the guise of benefiting us.
Yeah.
And I think that's a real risk. Do you think that's true?
I mean, I think that's been true like long before generative AI. Like often the promise of major technology platforms is like, we will offer you a service, often free, that is going to benefit you, make your life easier. And in exchange, often there is a cost that the person is not even necessarily aware that they are paying, which is that they're paying with personal data through their usage patterns, whether it's through conversation, like with a chatbot. And so I think what I find relevant about this, and to bring it back to OneTaste, is this, what brings people in is this belief that what they're going to get out of it is a benefit to them. And I heard again and again from people who were involved in OneTaste and who made some of these, who took actions that they later regretted or felt like they were pressured to do, that often some of the thinking behind it was like, well, I thought it was going to lead to personal growth. I was led to believe that this would help me understand myself better, improve my sexuality, help me connect more to capital O orgasm, which, as your listeners may or may not know, was kind of the OneTaste term for like semi-spiritual, like erotic energy.
Nice.
It's a little hard to define, but it was kind of this like transcendent force that people could tap into. And people had also described going along with assignments or requests from Nicole or their OneTaste leadership because they felt like they trusted Nicole. They felt that she had their best interests at heart. And so often when people think, I think from the outside, when they think casually about an environment like OneTaste where there might be allegations of like exploitative pressures or extractive dynamics, they have this idea that like it is this dark and sinister method of like pulling resources or energy from followers of the group. But I often found that in the moment, it was like people really believed that they were going to like benefit from something by handing over their autonomy and decision making to a leader or someone who claimed to have access to like more elevated knowledge about whatever experience that we were discussing. So if Nicole comes along and claims like, maybe I've experienced the darkness of sexuality in the past and I have, transcended through my study of Om to this higher plane where I have access to capital O orgasm, or I understand things. And if you follow my way, you can understand them too. I think it's fair to say that that's, part of the broad promise of OneTaste. Then you understand why people felt drawn to hand over their autonomy to her, if in fact they did. And so again, it's that sense of like, well, I believe that I'm going to benefit from this arrangement, and that maybe that's why someone in that position chose to, like follow in footsteps that later they felt like were actually damaging.
Well, and just to continue the allegory, this is the promise from Elon Musk, OpenAI, X, and is this thing is going to give us a transcendent part of human experience if we just give it, full reign over our communications with it. And what I found personally was that I actually did experience a transcendent transformation as part of my relationship with OneTaste and with Om. And it was because I was willing to occupy my boundaries in a firm way. And I had a really clear, self-aware, stable psychological profile that had me be able to do that. And so my personal growth path continues to be, where's my edge? What happens if I step beyond my comfort zone, acquire the knowledge, re-examine, set up another hypothesis, take the leap of faith of investigating, and repeat. And so I think it's a kind of cosmic mirror. You see and receive what you get out of it is directly proportionate to what you put into it, and the level of discernment and self-discipline that you have to keep your character, your soul, your personage intact in relationship to these dynamic influences, whether that be the intense, powerful sexual energy that arises in a situation like OneTaste and its intoxicating effect, or the intoxicating effect of being at the edge of the promise of artificial intelligence being like a gateway to no longer having to work, right? Which Elon has explicitly told us in the last few days on X is what's coming, right? And in that sense, both of these evangelical characters are somewhat over-promising, right? And perhaps snake oil salesman at a level. But having been through the crucible, if you will, of asking a woman to Om multiple times, experiencing what I experienced there, I received a lot of benefit from that. Mm-hmm. And when I sit down with my favorite LLM right now, I recognize its limitations right away, and I have to work with my own substance, my own elemental capacity for discernment and knowledge to make the tool benefit me.
Yeah.
Right. And that's the key delineation, is if you give yourself over, that's the point where you go beyond the event horizon, you fall into the black hole of it.
What I find interesting is, even in this triad of conversation that we're all engaged in, I find myself wanting to land in a place of mutual agreement, of black and white. And part of what is coming up for me is to let go of that as a living entity. Be comfortable in that gray space. I loved how you started your book with the analogy of the elephant and the blind people.
Yeah.
Can I continually remain conscious at this moment is limited in its experience, because our capacity as humans is limited and continually unfolding into this realm of the infinite?
I have also learned a lot about myself as a person in the last few years in how much I struggle with, I guess, what I would term disharmony. Like social disharmony is very challenging for me. And so when people talk about, whether it's orgasmic meditation or any other sort of mindfulness practice, and I do, like a moderate amount of basic sitting meditation. Like, I think being comfortable with discomfort is a personal goal of mine, and something that I have gradually come to recognize would be extremely beneficial to me in the long run if I can explore that further. So that's what I hear when I hear what you're talking about. And I think, yeah, as with all things, being able to notice it is kind of the first step. Otherwise, what would be a good phrase? Like, yeah, up a creek without a paddle.
Yeah. There's so many great metaphors for that. What I noticed in reading your book was that a lot of people who felt a lot of pain were able to feel honored and validated in their experience of it. And people who wanted to maintain their relationship with the benefits of what Nicole's offer have a little bit more challenging way to go in terms of that. And that's not necessarily about you. That's about the facts, which is that there was a crime committed and someone's been convicted of those crimes. And that's, to the best that we can do in our culture with the system of justice we have, that is a fact. Mm-hmm. That there is not only just the perception of harm, but the actual acknowledgement of harm through an institution that's designed to weed out in it the best way. And I love the quote, like, I love the jury system and in America, and it's flawed, but when I look out at the rest of the world, it's still the best system.
Yeah.
Right. So I think this is a provocative gateway. This book is a provocative gateway into the discussion that we've just had, and this idea of what are villains, and what is hubris, and when does a good idea run away with us into an extractive, dollar chasing, problematic point, and then what does the person who does that receive as their reward in terms of consequences? Like, there's money, but there's also this self-reflective, well, what have I done sort of piece. Mm-hmm. So I'm grateful that you took the time to sit with us and to have this conversation, that you took the time to write the book, because my relationship with orgasmic meditation had become very distant. And as a result of reading the book, I was able to reconnect with the richness of the emotional benefits that I got from it, as well as the cautionary tales I had of how easily seduced I am. Like, I consider ice cream problematic in my life. So I just want to express my gratitude to that and honor that you are a woman who took a courageous journey to do the best job you could to tell the truth. And thank you for that and your time. And we have a couple questions that we usually end with. And the first one I'll just say, is there anything that you really want our listeners to know about you or about the book that we haven't covered?
Yeah, I really appreciate what you just said. And I think if there's one parting thought I'd like to leave with people is like, my deepest hope is that if anything about this conversation has like piqued your interest about OneTaste, and not just OneTaste like in a limited scope, but kind of the emotional landscape that is evoked by, I don't know, the experience of being in this group, like that you, yeah, take time to look at the book and to read it with an open mind, because I think that my goal really was to lay out, you know, to use both the details of what I found, which again, like, are the backbone of any sort of reported narrative, but to also, yeah, provoke and ask, like, what does it mean to weigh the trade-offs of like victim villain mindsets or labels? Like, what are the benefits of having that framework? What are the benefits of rejecting that framework? Yeah, where does a good idea start to go sour? What does it, you know, what could drive someone to both, you know, create an environment that has, where you have people who walk away and say both that I was healed and I was harmed, and maybe some people saying both. Like, to me, that's incredibly rich. And I think that you know, the readers who are able to engage with that while holding multiple points of view at once and recognizing all of them as having value, like, I really, really believe that that is an intellectual and emotional experience that can enrich someone's life, is to contemplate some of these complicated things that humans have done, and to try to hold them in their contradictions. And you know, when I reflect on the 5 or arguably 7 years that I spent writing this book, you know, of course, like, 7 years of my life has elapsed during this period of time. You cannot know what changes in my life are the result of me engaging with this topic at the depth that I did, versus just how would my life have changed even if I didn't write this book? Like, a process of maturation, of evolution, perhaps, hopefully maturation has occurred over the course of those 7 years. But I guess I feel like I am a different person for having engaged with the ideas in this book. And if nothing else, the experience of researching these ideas, refining my thoughts about them, and putting them to the page in a way that I could stand by and feel is beneficial to other people has been of the most benefit to myself. And of course, I hope that other people who read the book experience some version of what I did in writing it. And that is the greatest joy of, you know, creating a work of art like this, and like hoping that other people like connect with it, and maybe even take away their own, you know, experiences that are vastly different from mine in creating it. I'm just one person, they are many. But that's my invitation, is like, I really, it has felt like a personal journey for me to spend time engaging with Nicole's ideas. You know, in some sense, I have dedicated a lot of time to being a kind of student of hers, not the usual kind, but I've spent a lot of time trying to understand her teachings. And I feel like I've changed as a result of that. So that's kind of, you know, that's what I would love to leave people with, and hope that that is like an invitation for them. You know, if any part of that resonated with you, I invite you to read the book. And I would really also love to hear from readers. Like, if any of your listeners read the book, and have any sort of thought or reaction or question or anything related to it, like, send me an email. Like I look forward to that aspect of publishing a book, which is engaging with readers thoughtfully about what it brought up for them.
Got it. Is it okay if we put that in the show notes, your current email address as we have it? Is there a better way for you to get contacted?
Why don't we put the website in and you have a contact me there?
Okay, we'll do that.
Yeah,
That's what
you can put on my website, and if I don't like to have it written out so that people can
just go blah.
But it is, if you look at my website and you put 10 to 15 seconds of effort into finding it, it is like you can determine.
That's how we connected with you. So it was
can determine what my email is, and I'm pretty open to it. I just don't want to.
Love it. All right, so we have one more question.
Yeah.
And we ask all of our guests this question. It's actually really deeply meaningful for us and fun. We love
it's our journalistic question.
Yeah. Greg?
Eminem or Foo Fighters?
Whoa. And what do they represent to you?
No, it's what do they represent to you?
That's the questions for you.
I'm gonna go Foo Fighters.
Okay.
And I won't be giving an explanation why.
All right. Perfect.
Thank you so much for joining us and for being so open about your love of the Foo Fighters. It's been quite a ride, Ellen.
I've been doxxed, yeah.
Yeah, really thank you for your time and energy. It's been deeply appreciated, and wish you all the best.
Thank you. Thanks for taking the time to talk.
If you'd like to order a copy of Ellen's book, Empire of Orgasm, you can find it at ellenhuet.com. That's ELLENHUET.com. Thanks for listening.
Recording stopped.